Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at some pretty intense ideas about men and women.
Oh, yeah.
And these are coming from a book called Queen's Code.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a fictional story,
Okay.
but it's got all these teachings about relationships woven in,
Interesting.
almost like a parable.
Okay.
And we're diving specifically into Chapter 3.
Gotcha. So we're approaching these teachings as they're presented in the book as like facts within that world.
Exactly.
So we can analyze just the idea.
Yeah, think of it less like a book club
Okay.
and more like we're extracting a whole philosophy to examine.
I like that.
And honestly, some of it is
Yeah.
pretty provocative, to say the least.
Yeah.
Like this core concept of castration.
Yeah, right off the bat, it's important to say that we are not talking about the literal medical procedure.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But the book uses this really loaded term
Yeah.
to describe something it claims women do to men.
Okay.
Not physically, but emotionally and psychologically.
Okay, so it's about depriving a man of his strength, power, or efficiency, weakening him, essentially.
Yeah, the book equates it to emasculation
Right.
in a broader sense.
Yeah, and the language in this book is very strong.
Oh, yeah,
It's a little unsettling at times.
for sure.
It says women do more damage with their hat pins and stilettos than with their machetes.
Whoa.
Obviously metaphorical,
Right.
but you get the intensity.
Yes, you feel it.
It's meant to be jarring to make you pay attention.
Yeah.
And I think it's trying to get at how seemingly small actions can have a big cumulative impact.
Yeah.
But before we get to those long-term effects, let's talk about the immediate reaction.
Okay.
How men respond to this castration.
Okay, so picture this. A man's just been castrated, as the book defines it.
Okay.
What's going through his head?
Well, the book describes it as a sudden shock to the system,
Uh-huh.
like a punch to the gut.
Oh, wow.
Mentally, there's confusion, disbelief,
Yeah.
maybe even a sense of betrayal.
Right.
Emotionally,
Yeah.
there's a surge of rage and fury,
Mm-hmm.
though how that's expressed can vary.
Right. It's not always an explosion.
Right.
The book talks about some men reacting physically, but in ways that are more internalized,
Yeah.
like a clenching in the chest, a slumping of the posture,
Exactly.
that kind of thing.
It's that feeling of being deflated,
Mhm.
diminished, having the wind knocked out of you.
Yeah.
And it's in these moments the book suggests
Uh-huh.
that the seeds of long-term resentment can be sown.
Okay, now this is where I start to wonder if some listeners are nodding their heads,
Yeah.
thinking, yeah, I've seen this.
Mm-hmm.
Because the book claims that if this castration continues over time,
Yeah.
it fundamentally changes how men relate to women.
The book makes some pretty bold claims about the long-term consequences.
Yeah,
And whether you agree with them or not, they definitely make you think.
for sure.
For example, it argues that men who are constantly castrated start to compete with women instead of cherishing them.
Wow.
They pull back emotionally,
Okay.
become suspicious.
And even treat women with disdain.
So basically the opposite of what
Oh.
most people would consider a healthy, loving relationship.
Exactly.
But the question is why?
Right.
Why would women engage in this behavior in the first place?
Well, according to the book,
Mm-hmm.
it boils down to this idea of the perfect person.
Okay.
Women, the book argues, often have this idealized image
Yeah.
of how a man should be.
Mm-hmm.
And when reality doesn't match up.
They see him as constantly misbehaving
Exactly.
and needing correction.
It's this constant comparison
Yeah.
that leads to frustration, disappointment,
Okay.
and ultimately the urge to castrate.
And the book suggests this isn't a conscious, malicious choice, but rather...
A learned pattern of behavior,
Okay.
often stemming from fear of men's power
Okay.
and a desire to control the relationship.
So it's interesting because the book portrays this castration as ultimately hurting both the man and the woman.
It's a self-defeating prophecy.
Yeah.
The more you try to control and diminish a man.
The more you push him away
Right.
and create the dynamic you were afraid of.
Now, the book doesn't let men completely off the hook.
No.
It introduces this concept of objectification as a kind of mirror image
Uh-huh.
of castration
Okay.
and argues that it triggers similar feelings of rage in women.
Interesting.
So if castration is about taking away a man's power,
yeah.
objectification is about reducing a woman to a thing.
A one-dimensional object.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's about seeing her as a collection of parts
Yes.
rather than a whole person.
And the book gives some examples of how this plays out.
Okay.
Like reducing a sexually provocative dancer to a harlot,
Oh, wow.
an angry woman to a shrew,
Okay.
or even a tantruming child to just a brat.
And those are just a few examples.
Right.
Because objectification can be a lot more subtle.
Oh, absolutely.
Like just focusing solely on a woman's appearance.
Yes.
Or dismissing her opinions because of her gender.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is that the book argues that objectification, just like castration, is often a reaction to feeling threatened or powerless.
It's a way of regaining control.
Right.
Albeit a destructive one.
Okay, so we've got these two harmful dynamics.
Yeah.
Castration and objectification. Both rooted in fear and a desire for control.
Right.
And according to the book, they feed into each other.
Yes.
Creating this vicious cycle.
A downward spiral.
But the book doesn't just leave us hanging.
No, it doesn't.
With this bleak picture.
It offers a potential solution.
It does.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The book introduces this radical idea of giving up the right to castrate.
Now, I know that phrase is loaded.
Yeah.
And we'll unpack it more in a bit.
Yeah.
But for now, I'm curious.
Yeah.
What was your initial reaction to that concept?
It definitely stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, to even think about castration as a right is challenging, right?
For sure.
It makes you question so many assumptions about how we relate to each other.
It really does. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of giving up that right might feel like a loss of power, a vulnerability they're not ready to embrace.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But the book argues that it's actually the key to unlocking a more fulfilling and equitable dynamic between men and women.
Interesting.
And that's what we'll explore further in the next part of this deep dive.
Can't wait.
It's almost like asking what, instead of trying to diminish men's power, we actually embraced it.
Yeah.
And not just embrace it, but help them channel it in a positive way.
Which, according to the book,
Yeah.
is what men actually want.
Exactly.
To be these strong, capable, heroic figures.
Yeah, and that's where this giving up the right to castrate comes in.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that this castration, even if unintentional, can be incredibly damaging.
Right.
The book uses a metaphor of slowly chipping away at a statue.
Okay.
You might not notice the damage at first, but over time...
You're left with something barely recognizable.
Exactly. And the book argues that this chipping away, this constant criticism and undermining can really erode a man's confidence, his sense of self-worth, even his willingness to be vulnerable in a relationship.
Which then feeds into that vicious cycle we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
The man feeling diminished resorts to objectification as a way to regain control.
Right.
And the woman seeing that feels justified in her castration.
It's a trap that both genders can fall into.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that the book doesn't just say, stop doing this.
Right.
It offers practical advice on how to actually break the cycle.
Like that homework assignment it gives, right?
Yes.
Encouraging readers to observe how castration is playing out in their everyday lives.
It's about raising that awareness.
Yeah.
Paying attention to those subtle ways. We might be diminishing men.
Right.
Whether intentionally or unconsciously.
And the book gives a whole list of these behaviors.
It does.
Some of which might surprise you.
Yeah, there's the obvious stuff.
You know, like outright criticism.
Right.
Comparing him unfavorably to others.
Yeah, but then it gets into those more subtle things, like withholding appreciation, not letting a man impress you.
Oh, okay.
Or even just not needing him for anything important.
It's like those behaviors communicate, I don't need you. I don't value your contributions.
Exactly. And even if that's not the intention, that's often how it's received.
And the book even goes into nonverbal cues.
Oh, yeah.
Like rolling your eyes, sighing dramatically, taking over tasks that a man was given.
It's amazing how those seemingly small things can add up.
It's death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Essentially, yes.
And the book emphasizes that this castration isn't just confined to romantic relationships.
Right. It can happen in families, workplaces, even just out in the world.
There's this scene in the book where Kimberly, one of the main characters, is at the grocery store. And she starts noticing all these subtle ways women are castrating men.
Interesting.
Like a mother scolding her son.
Okay.
A cashier being impatient with an older man.
Yeah.
A woman snapping at her husband over which brand of cereal to buy.
And what's interesting is that Kimberly's own reaction to these scenes has changed.
Okay.
Before, she would have just seen it as normal, maybe even funny. But now she feels this empathy for the men.
Right.
This understanding of how those little interactions can chip away at their sense of self.
It's like she's seeing the world through a new lens.
Exactly.
And I wonder if some of our listeners are having a similar experience right now.
Yeah.
As you're listening to this, are Are you starting to see castration play out in your own life?
It can be eye-opening.
Yeah.
And it can be uncomfortable.
Right.
Because it challenges those deeply ingrained beliefs we have.
Right.
About gender roles and power dynamics.
If we're honest with ourselves, I think most of us have engaged in some form of castration at some, maybe not intentionally.
Yeah.
But those subtle digs,
right.
Those dismissive comments.
Yeah, eye rolls.
Yeah, they all contribute.
This larger pattern.
And the book argues that if we want to break this cycle, we have to start by acknowledging our own role in it.
Absolutely.
Which brings us back to this idea of giving up the right to castrate.
Oh, okay. So let's unpack that a bit more.
Yeah. What does it actually mean? Does it mean women should never disagree with men?
No, not at all.
Never challenge them.
The book is very clear about that.
Okay.
It's not about becoming passive or submissive.
Right.
It's about recognizing castration as a specific behavior pattern that ultimately undermines both men and women.
So it's less about giving up a right.
Right.
And more about breaking a bad habit.
Exactly. It's about shifting away from that default mode of seeing men as incompetent or misbehaving.
Right.
And needing to be corrected.
And replacing it with what? Trust, respect, a genuine belief in men's ability to rise to the occasion.
That's the ideal, yes.
Yeah.
But the book acknowledges it's not easy.
Right.
It requires a leap of faith, especially if you've been hurt or disappointed by men in the past.
And speaking of hurt and disappointment, let's not forget about objectification.
Right.
Because the book presents this as the flip side of the coin.
Exactly a way that men diminish women when they feel threatened or powerless.
And to really illustrate this point, the book brings in Bert.
Okay.
The male character who embodies the Queen's Code philosophy.
Right.
He's asked to share his own experiences with objectification, and he's brutally honest about it.
He talks about 3 specific instances.
Yeah. The time he mentally labeled a dancer in a strip club a harlot.
Oh, okay.
Then there's the time he called an angry customer a shrew in his head. And then, perhaps most tellingly, the time he reduced his own granddaughter's tantrums to her just being a brat.
And what's striking is that he doesn't try to justify these actions. He owns them as examples of how he, in moments of feeling overwhelmed or challenged, resorted to objectification as a way to distance himself emotionally.
It's like he was trying to protect himself by dehumanizing the women involved.
Exactly. And what's important is that he recognizes this as a harmful pattern, not just for the women, but for himself as well.
Right, because it prevents him from connecting on a deeper level, from seeing them as fully human.
And it perpetuates that cycle of mistrust and resentment.
Right, because when a woman feels objectified, it reinforces her belief that men are dangerous, untrustworthy, that she needs to protect herself by castrating them.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy on both sides.
Yeah, and I think what the book is trying to do is break down those walls, those ingrained patterns of behavior, and offer a glimpse of what's possible when men and women can relate to each other from a place of mutual respect and understanding.
And that's where this idea of the language of heroes comes in.
Okay.
The book suggests that there's a way to communicate with men that speaks to their deeper desires, their innate need to feel strong, capable, and respected.
And that by using this language, we can actually inspire them to step up.
Yes.
To become the men they're capable of being.
But it's crucial that this language is used authentically.
Right.
From a place of genuine respect and a desire for partnership.
It's not about manipulation or trying to control men.
No.
It's about tapping into their strengths.
Yes.
And creating a dynamic where everyone thrives.
And this is where the book gets really radical.
Okay.
It suggests that men actually need women.
Okay.
Not just for companionship or sex, but on an energetic level.
It talks about how men are nurtured, recharged, simply by being in the presence of a contented woman.
There's this scene where Karen, one of the characters, remembers how her husband used to love just sitting with her while he watched football.
Interesting.
Or going for drives with her.
Okay.
Even though they wouldn't talk much.
And she realizes that it wasn't about him needing her to entertain him. Or be his audience.
Right.
It was about him simply absorbing her energy.
Yes.
Her contentment.
It's like this subtle exchange that happens beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And the book argues that when women are constantly castrating men, it disrupts this flow of energy.
It's like they're draining the men instead of nurturing them.
Exactly.
Which then leads to resentment, frustration.
Right.
and ultimately those destructive patterns of behavior.
It's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
And I think it challenges a lot of our assumptions about what men need from women.
Yeah.
And what true partnership really looks like.
So if we were to sum up the Queen's Code philosophy,
yeah,
what would you say are the key takeaways?
I think it boils down to 3 core principles.
Okay.
Understanding respect and partnership.
Okay.
Understanding that men are wired differently than women and that they respond to different kinds of communication. Respecting their strengths and their need to feel valued and appreciated.
Right.
And approaching relationships as a partnership.
Yeah.
Where both parties are committed to each other's growth and well-being.
It's a pretty ambitious vision.
It is.
But I think it's one worth striving for.
I agree.
And even if we don't always get it right, even if we slip up and fall back into old patterns, I think the awareness we've gained from this deep dive is a huge step in the right direction.
I agree. And I think the book leaves us with a really powerful challenge.
Okay.
What if, instead of seeing men as the problem, we saw them as part of the solution?
Interesting.
What if, by shifting our own behavior, we could actually inspire them to become better partners, better fathers, better men?
That is a really thought-provoking question.
It is.
To end on.
And I think it's one that each of us needs to answer for ourselves.
Yeah, so to our listeners, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated most with you from this deep dive into Queen's Code? What are you taking away from this conversation?
We've only scratched the surface of this book and its teachings.
Yeah.
But hopefully it sparks some new ideas and maybe even a desire to explore this Queen's Code further.
Yeah, in your own lives.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and keep exploring those uncharted territories of human connection. Okay, so it feels like we're on the verge of something big here.
Yeah.
Like we've identified these harmful patterns.
Right, castration and objectification.
But now the question is, what do we do about it?
Right.
How do we actually shift to this Queen's Code way of being?
Well, the book definitely doesn't offer any, easy answers.
Right.
It's not a step-by-step guide to perfect relationships or anything.
Oh.
But it does present some thought-provoking ideas about what it means to really partner with men, to see them as allies rather than adversaries.
And one of the first steps, according to the book, is recognizing that giving up the right to castrate isn't just a one-time decision.
Right. It's an ongoing process.
Okay.
A conscious choice you make every day.
It's like learning a new language.
Exactly.
You're not going to be fluent overnight.
Right.
There will be slip-ups, moments where you fall back into old patterns.
For sure.
But the key is to keep practicing.
Yeah.
Keep challenging yourself. And have compassion for yourself when you make mistakes.
Absolutely.
Because let's be honest, can be tough.
It can.
Especially if you've been hurt or betrayed in the past.
Yeah. You want to protect yourself.
Right.
Hold on to that, right, as a way of maintaining control.
The book addresses this directly.
It does.
There's a scene where Kimberly, who's been cheated on in the past, asks, do we have to trust men to do this?
Right.
And Claudia, the mentor figure, gives a really nuanced answer.
What does she say?
She says, trusting men is something that takes time. First, you have to learn what they can be trusted for.
I see. So it's not about blind faith.
Right.
It's about starting small, building trust brick by brick, based on a man's actions and his consistency over time.
And this is where the book brings in this idea of the language of heroes.
Oh, yeah.
Suggesting there's a way to communicate with men that speaks to their deeper desires.
Okay.
Their innate need to feel strong, capable, respected.
And that by using this language, we can actually inspire them to step up.
Exactly.
To become the men they're capable of being.
But it's crucial that this language is used authentically.
Oh, for sure.
From a place of genuine respect.
Right.
And a desire for partnership.
Not about manipulation.
Right.
Or trying to control them.
It's about tapping into their strengths.
Yes.
Creating a dynamic where everyone thrives.
And this is where the book gets really radical.
Okay, lay it on me.
It suggests that men actually need women.
Okay.
Not just for companionship or sex, but on an energetic level. It talks about how men are nurtured, recharged, simply by being in the presence of a contented woman.
Wow.
There's this scene where Karen, one of the characters, remembers how her husband used to love just sitting with her while he watched football.
Okay.
Or going for drives with her, even though they wouldn't talk much.
So she realizes it wasn't about needing her to entertain him.
No.
Or be his audience.
Right.
It was about him just absorbing her energy,
Yes.
her contentment.
It's like this subtle exchange that happens beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And the book argues that when women are constantly castrating men, it disrupts this flow.
It's like they're draining them instead of nurturing them.
Exactly.
Which then leads to the resentment, the frustration.
Yeah.
Ultimately, those destructive patterns.
It's a powerful idea.
It is.
And I think it challenges a lot of our assumptions about what men need from women.
Yeah.
And what true partnership looks like.
Okay, so if we were to sum up the Queen's Code philosophy, what would you say are the key takeaways?
I think it boils down to 3 core principles.
Okay, hit me.
Understanding respect and partnership.
Okay.
Understanding that men are wired differently than women, that they respond to different kinds of communication, respecting their strengths and their need to feel valued and appreciated.
Right.
And approaching relationships as a partnership where both parties are committed to each other's growth and well-being.
That's a pretty ambitious vision.
It is.
But I think it's one worth striving for.
I agree.
And even if we don't always get it right, even if we slip up and fall back into old patterns, I think the awareness we've gained from this deep dive is huge.
It's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I think the book leaves us with a really powerful challenge.
What is that?
What if instead of seeing men as the problem, we saw them as part of the solution?
Interesting.
What if, by shifting our own behavior, we could inspire them to become better partners, better fathers, better men?
That's a really thought-provoking question to end on.
It is.
And I think it's one that each of us needs to answer for ourselves.
For sure.
So to our listeners, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
What resonated most with you from this deep dive into Queen's Code?
Yeah.
What are you taking away from this conversation?
We've only scratched the surface of this book and its teachings, but hopefully it sparks some new ideas.
For sure.
And maybe even a desire to explore this Queen's Code further in your own lives.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and keep exploring those uncharted territories of human connection.